Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Joining me is Scott Walter. He's the president of Capital Research Center and author of a new book, Arabella, the Dark Money Network of Leftist Billionaires Secretly Transforming America. He served in the George W. Bush administration as special assistant to the president for domestic policy and was vice president of the Philosophy Roundtable, editing Philanthropy magazine and producing donor guidebooks on assistance to the poor, public policy research, and other topics. Walter has testified to 5 different congressional committees about Arabella and related subjects and about dark money nonprofits to the U.S. Senate, the IRS, and state legislatures. And Scott, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your new book, Arabella.
Great to be with you.
So first off, what is Arabella? What are we talking about? What is that? What is that entity doing?
Sure. The central word to understand is network, right? It's a network. Now, to visualize how it operates, think of a pyramid. At the top of the pyramid, you have Arabella Advisors, a for-profit PR consulting firm in DC. They call them Beltway Bandits, right?
Right.
And it operates and creates everything below it on the pyramid. In the middle of the pyramid, you have half a dozen nonprofits of multiple legal types. That's where the money goes in. You write a check if you're a billionaire or foundation to those groups. And then the base of the pyramid, that's what your viewers actually encounter with Arabella. And that's Opportunity Wisconsin, Floridians for a Fair Shake, Secure Michigan Elections, all these wonderful selfless groups, right? They want you to think that those are your local neighbors upset about something, when in fact it's some goofball at his desk in a DC office creating a website, buying a Facebook ad, using a particular accounting code. The only existence the group really has is as an accounting code in this multi-billion-dollar network.
So basically, this is the Happy Sunshine Puppy advocacy firm. I mean, it's, you can kind of string together whatever you want. These are the various, front is maybe a little too strong a word, but storefronts maybe is a better way of putting it. These are the various storefronts for Arabella.
Exactly.
So, I mean, we have a long history of money in the political system, right? And people, we had Citizens United, for instance. It was a big Supreme Court decision that the left absolutely hated and then adopted. And this is something a little different, though. This is I wouldn't say it's a secret organization, but it certainly sounds like something that they really don't want discussed a whole lot.
Yes. May I brag on my team? It was my colleagues who first uncovered Arabella half a decade ago, and when it was a mere $750 million a year or so operation, and no conservative or mainstream media outlet had ever covered Arabella. Shockingly, now we get to talk about them all the time on lots of shows like yours, in front of half a dozen different congressional committees. So things are better now. So
just to give people an idea of the scope of this, right? I mean, you just said $750 million like it was nothing. I wouldn't mind, maybe about 1/100th of that, and I'd be happy to talk about anything. But I mean, that's sort of a piker level as to where Arabella is right now. How much did Arabella spend in the 2020 presidential cycle?
Well, the nonprofits took in during the 2020 cycle, so that's 2 years, $2.4 billion. And in case you're wondering for a reference, that is more than the DNC plus the RNC, and then add $1 billion. Okay. Now in 2022, you would think that's an off year, right? So they have to have, maybe come down a little bit. Wrong. $3 billion for the 22 cycle. That's more than the DNC, the RNC, the Republican Senate and House Committee, the Democrat Senate and House Committee. Roll all those together, you still got to add $500 million to get to Arabella's revenues.
So Arabella is not out there putting out the ads as Arabella, clearly, right? I mean, maybe the Happy Sunshine Puppy advocacy thing is doing little web ads and stuff like that, but they're not really looking for small donors, right? they're looking, they already have, I mean, they're structured so that people who have a humongous amount of money can effectively put it to use and quietly put it to use in the American political system. So there's a couple of questions that come to mind with this. The first is, who are they? Who are the people who are funding, who are the part of the mechanism here of Arabella at the top?
Well, of course, there's the cliche that Soros is, but the thing you always have to remember is the left has a lot of Soroses, right?
Right.
So Bill Gates is actually one of the biggest funders. Zuckerberg, giving him tens of millions of dollars. Pierre Omidyar, the eBay billionaire who also is the #1 Never Trump funder, he's given millions. The Ford Foundation and a whole bunch of other really bad left-wing foundations. In fact, many of the left's worst billionaires all have the same last name, Foundation. So one more that deserves extra special attention, Hans-Jörg Wyss. I bet not many of your listeners have heard of that.
I don't think I've heard of that either.
Well, exactly. He is a Swiss billionaire. He is not a U.S. citizen, doesn't even have a green card. Therefore, of course, by law is absolutely forbidden to be meddling in our politics. But he has been one of their biggest donors, and as best we can tell, was their original sugar daddy as they were getting off the ground in the aughts, right? The year that they broke past the $1 million barrier, they took in 1.7 million, and $1 million of the 1.7 was old Hans-Jörg. Now, he has done the really blatantly illegal thing of writing checks to politicians, right? As a foreign national, absolutely no gray area there, absolutely
Right, that's
illegal.
black letter law, yeah.
Yeah, black letter law. He did over $100,000 worth of such checks. Unfortunately, nobody discovered it until the statute of limitations had expired. But if you don't believe me, you can literally go to the FEC database and punch his name in. You'll find over $100,000. My personal favorite, by the way, of the recipients was Friends of Dick Durbin Committee.
Does he have it? I mean, that may be breaking news right here, Scott Walter. You know,
well, it was years ago. It wasn't a whole lot of money, and it was years ago. But given how Dick Durbin likes to probe into the Supreme Court's finances, I think it's well worth Americans knowing about that. But here's the thing. So that was really dumb, and he's lucky he wasn't caught in time. But he's smarter now. Now he gives tens of millions of dollars a year, typically $250 million in total, just to the Arabella network. Now, he's also done $250 million total that we know of to other political nonprofit things outside of Arabella, but $250 million to Arabella. Now, here's the tricky thing, Ed. So can Hans-Jörg write a check to a super PAC? No. Can Hans-Jörg write a check to a 501c4 political nonprofit run by Arabella, who then gives the money to a super PAC? Well, that is a gray area. Now, Arabella and Wyss proclaim that they're very careful and that never happens, though he does give to the C4 and the C4 does give to super PACs. However, when Bloomberg was writing this grotesque sycophantic article trying to defend Wyss from the attacks that he's getting more and more, not just from my shop, but other folks, they were doing a big suck-up article on him about this very issue. Now, he and Arabella could easily have said, look, you can't make these public, but we'll let you look at our books and you can see how we carefully segregate the monies and that those foreign dollars never go to the super PAC. They didn't do that, even with the sycophantic reporters. And by the way, even if they did show that, of course, money is fungible. That's, right. Everybody knows that. If you're old enough not to keep your money in a piggy bank, you know that.
Right. Well, and here's the question, I guess, too. I mean, we're you mentioned the Ford Foundation, you mentioned other foundations. Now, apart from Wyss, right, who's a foreign national and really isn't supposed to be kicking into things like this, most of the foundations you're talking about can operate that way. In fact, they're actually sort of doing money laundering, essentially, is what I will say. Money laundering in a generic sense. I'm not accusing anybody of a crime, but in the generic sense, that's what it looks like. So if they're laundering money, that wouldn't necessarily be legal if it came directly in, but the Ford Foundation can do this stuff. Some of the other foundations can do this stuff. So why don't they just do it on their own? Why do they need Arabella?
Well, I think that for multiple reasons. First of all, it does obscure things more, right? If you write a check to one of the, I told you, there's the 3 levels of Arabella. That middle level of the nonprofits, each one of those half dozen nonprofits Arabella operates, it creates dozens, even hundreds of different other, things on the bottom of the pyramid, right? That are the public facing things. You don't know for sure where that Ford Foundation money ended up, right? So, right. Whereas if Ford just writes a check directly to some group, well, then you do, because they have to disclose that. So it does help to obscure things. The other thing I really think is that they like complexity, because it makes it harder for somebody like me to explain what's going on. Right? Like the Soros, for instance, Soros has all these different, he has more entities than he needs that are his, core groups. He has multiple foundations. You don't need more than one foundation, right? I mean, he has multiple this, that, and the other things. And on top of that, every 5 or 10 years, they change their name a bit. So again, it makes it harder for somebody like me to trace the money. And then when I have to explain to you, well, the money came from this group, but then it was renamed this, and it also came from that, and then it went through this, right? Normal human beings' eyes glaze over, and my ability to expose them and to make them get in trouble for what they're doing, all these things, help to lessen that.
Yeah. I mean, and that's kind of the reason why I asked the question, is that there's a lot of complexity here where there doesn't appear or it doesn't appear to be needed, and that usually tells me that somebody's doing something that they don't want traced back to them, right? The Ford Foundation, the Tides is another one that I think we're going to talk about a little bit here. Is another one that doesn't like to have things directly point back to them, especially when things don't turn out well from their advocacy. Soros is another one, and you could even say that having, I don't know, 20 or so shell companies to massage income that's coming in from overseas is probably more than the Biden family actually needed to receive those funds. But I know it's a different subject, but it's part of the same type of complexity for complexity's sake. It's a dodge. It's a dodge for accountability.
Yeah, it makes it harder to be sure what really happened, and it makes it harder to tell the story. So, and yes, I would say the 20 Biden family shell companies is probably a good example of that as well.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what Arabella is advocating for, right? Is this just policy? I mean, is this just, well, we want to make sure that the shellfish, tariff structure remains in place because we think it'll be really good for American fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico type of thing, which is usually there's advocacy things surrounding all of those types of policy questions, and they're completely legitimate because the Constitution allows us to petition our government for these things, and then you certainly can organize to do that. Or is this something else? Is there a larger purpose behind what Arabella is doing?
Well, first of all, the short answer to what it's doing is everything, because there's virtually no issue area. Virtually no issue area they're not active in. But here is, and I can't see into their souls to be certain of their motivation. But I can, on the other hand, I can recognize patterns, and the pretty simple pattern is: first, whatever our billionaire folks want done, or people they want pushed up or down. And more generally, more power, and money usually comes with that, more power and money for a very centralized elite, and less money and power for people who live where you do.
Well, especially where I do. All right, Scott. I mean, this is part of a theme that I've been pursuing. Sort of a little bit lonely on the right here, which is that people should have been concerned about all of the mergers, acquisitions, and concentrations of economic power over the last 4 decades than they have been. And I'm not necessarily saying that the government needs to break up all of the different companies. But I think part of what we're seeing here, and the reason why you can have an Arabella, is not because of Citizens United, but because we've allowed people to acquire and consolidate industries so that more and more money is getting into fewer and fewer hands, and economic power equals political power. Is that what we're also seeing in the Arabella network?
Well, Arabella certainly does not cater to the folks at your local grocery store.
Right.
And I will add that, I learned from Milton Friedman, the great libertarian economist, that one of the reasons to oppose big government is because typically over time, big business ends up being cronies with the big government. So right. I don't have all the answers, but I think it's very reasonable to say big is bad.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, big is bad. Big as in big government, and big as in big business.
Now, and big labor. And big labor union.
Absolutely big labor is that's almost a given, especially in big government contexts, right? You've got big labor involved in the federal government, state governments, and they end up warping policy to benefit the union, typically the union leaders. And education is a really great example of that, but that's a little bit off the path of what you're doing with Arabella. We've got a number of what's a good way of putting this? Culture rattling trends going on right now, right? And when we talk about follow the money, which is what you're doing in the book Arabella, the Dark Money Network of Leftist Billionaires Secretly Transforming America, we're talking about following the money, and you followed a hell of a lot of it back to Arabella. How much of that is going into the things that we're seeing right now? And I would say, after talking with you briefly before we started recording, I know that you got something to say about Title IX changes in Arabella, and also, what's going on college campuses, the unrest that we're seeing in cities over the last 4 years or so, the Black Lives Matter movement, and that sort of thing. How much of that can be traced back to Arabella or any other large dark money type of operation?
Sure. There's a variety of things. So I told you Zuckerberg gives millions to Arabella. Most of the money he gives them, sadly, is for criminal justice reform, similar to the kind practiced by George Soros's horrible DAs around the country. So sadly, I wish Soros were the only billionaire doing that. Unfortunately, he's not. So that'd be one example. Another example is just this past week or so in the news, you've had lefties trying to force Sonia Sotomayor off the court, right? So they can put in somebody younger and worse than she. Well, guess who first stuck into the public debate some embarrassing medical records of Sotomayor's? Something called Fix the Court. Guess what spawned Fix the Court? Arabella. And by the way,
storefront, another Arabella storefront.
Yes. Yeah. And in this case, before the Sotomayor, of course, there was the forcing of Stephen Breyer off the court. Well, that was done by another Arabella SCOTUS-related entity called Demand Justice, also created by Arabella.
I know Demand Justice.
Yes. Now they're pushing the court packing and the court shrinking, right? Because when you smear the court and say they have to recuse, you can shrink it, since sadly, this is the problem for the left, right? The overwhelming majority of Americans does not want a hard left agenda. So they do run into that problem from time to time. And so Demand Justice will shrink the court or expand it, whatever might happen to help the left this afternoon. But they bragged about pushing Breyer off the court. Also, would you like to know one of their employees? I bet you've heard her name before. Jen Psaki.
Oh,
she comes from Demand Justice. And
I got to ask you
So,
a question really quickly. I just got to ask you a
mhm.
question. This just came up, and I don't know if you know it. So I mean, and dear viewers, I am officially sandbagging poor Scott Walter, who's here to talk about his book, Arabella. But I'm curious if Nina Jankowicz has any, if you came across any sort of connections there between Nina Jankowicz and Arabella or Arabella-esque organizations. Nina Jankowicz, just in case I'm really throwing you for a loop, she was the one who was supposed to be the disinformation czar for Joe
Yes,
Biden.
no, no. I know who she is. I'm just trying to remember if there's I would happily bet you a beer that I can find a connection, but off the top of my head, I'm not remembering a connection with
Yeah,
her.
I
Oh
mean,
no, I know her. By the way, our influencewatch.org website, which is our Wikipedia of the left online.
yeah.
Uh, if you while you're talking to me, you're welcome to dial that up, and I'm sure we have a Nina Jankowicz entry in there for her. But yeah, the
What was the
misinformation
website again?
folks.
What was the website again? I'll do that while you're talking.
Influencewatch.org.
Well, that's a good one for you guys to remember too, viewers. Influencewatch.org.
Yeah,
So
I have to give a consumer warning. When you go in the first time, you're probably losing the next 5 hours of your life because you're just going to go down rabbit hole after rabbit hole. Because again, it's like Wikipedia, right? It's all interlinked. The unions, the foundations, the donors, the groups, the Arabella, yada yada. Literally 13,500 entries and growing every day on all these wonderful folks with all their interconnections and all their money flows and the rest. So I literally was talking to a top Senate staffer yesterday afternoon, and I said, "Now you know Influence Watch, don't you?" He laughed in my face. He said, "My browser opens it as a tab automatically when I turn the computer on."
that's great, though. That's great. Yeah,
Yes,
there is actually an entry for Nina Jankowicz. She has a new group put together.
yes.
I'm trying to think of the name of it off the top of my head. And I went to discoverthenetworks.org, I think it is.
Yep, that's David Horowitz's good site.
David Horowitz's good site, and they didn't have an entry for her new group, but I suspect it's probably because it's pretty new. And I would be very interested to see if there's Arabella money going into that, because this is part of that whole, disinformation censorship campaign that the Biden administration wanted to kick into high gear, and she's back and she's trying to do it again. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Arabella or other dark money groups were funding it. Anyway, that was sort of a rabbit hole. I apologize for that.
Yeah, we were on Arabella's things in the news, and I have another one for you because this is a big one in the news just these past few days. The Department of Education, which of course probably shouldn't exist, but the Department of Education revised its Title IX rule, which governs forcing men into women's sports. A highly controversial issue. Again, one overwhelmingly with the majority of Americans on one side and your billionaire class on the other side. Well, that's a fascinating story. It's a great example of how my colleagues at Capital Research Center just are constantly finding the most magnificent stuff. Our truffle hunters are second to none. And so here's what we discovered. All the way back in 2019, so 2 years before the Biden administration gets sworn in, the guy who is head of the head of Soros's main foundation at the time, Tom Perriello, failed congressional and gubernatorial candidate in my home state of Virginia. He reaches out to a pal at Harvard Law School, a professor at Harvard Law, hires the man's daughter to run this new entity. And by the way, the daughter, while she was still a law school student, in her FEC contributions thing, she says her occupation is law school student, and yet she maxed out to this Soros guy, Perriello, for his campaigns. Fascinating. It's just lucky her last name isn't D'Souza, because she might have gotten in trouble for that. But anyway, she's going to run the thing. Daddy and other Harvard Law types are going to be working on it. And the thing is called Governing for Impact. And they create a website, and it's a secret website. You can set your website up so that no search engine can ever find it. But if I emailed you the URL for the site and you type that into your browser, well, then it would come up, right? So your browser could go straight to the site, but nobody could ever find it.
That's
now.
interesting.
So what Governing for Impact does, with the help of Harvard Law folks, is it begins to produce dozens and dozens of very sophisticated legal strategy memos for how to overturn all kinds of things that happened in the previous administration that most Americans like. And so one of them was this Title IX reg. And again, I don't know how much you've ever gotten into the regulatory process, but as somebody who for my sins, I was on the federal payroll briefly at the White House some years ago, and I had to deal with this a little. It is Byzantine, the whole process of how you make regs, how you adjust them, how you throw them out and put new ones in. This is extremely complicated legal issues,
Right.
and you really want to be smart, and you want to have Harvard Law people doing your strategy. So these dozens of memos get written up for the Education Department, the Interior Department, the EPA, on 6 more departments. Dozens of these things get written up and secretly shared through the secret website. We also found, by the way, a slide deck where they were bragging about what they'd done and how, and you could see they were talking literally with the top person at OMB. OMB oversees all regulations. There's a department or a section of OMB that's the gatekeeper for all regs. They were lobbying that woman, not with any registration, of course, but lobbying that woman and meeting with all these folks, and have amazing strategy for these radical changes to American life that are wildly unpopular. And if it hadn't been for us, nobody would ever have found out about it. But when that former congressman, Soros Foundation head, wanted to do it, what does he do? He goes to Arabella and has them pop up a C3 entity, a 501c3 charitable entity, and a 501c4 political nonprofit to put, that could advocate more openly for the secret regulatory reforms they're working on. So it's just, and by the way, within a year, they had gotten at least 20 of these things through.
It's amazing. And there's more of this in the book, Arabella, the Dark Money Network of Leftist Billionaires Secretly Transforming America. I want to just wrap up on a couple of points, and you can be brief on this. First off, and I know that I'm curious about this, and I'll bet that a lot of the people who are watching this are going to be curious about this. Is there an analogous organization or network on the right that does something similar to this, or is this really just unique to the left?
There is nothing on the conservative side that is nearly as big as Arabella in money terms. That's easy. Never forget, the left is the party of the rich.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But there have been a few efforts to use a similar kind of organizational structure. So some of the conservative judicial activists, for instance, have created something similar to this. The Conservative Partnership Institute is willing to do the technical term for the little groups on the bottom are their fiscally sponsored projects. So the Conservative Partnership Institute also is willing to do fiscally sponsored projects and whatnot. And it's not crazy. I mean, it's not crazy. The reason it exists in the first place in the law is because this is a way for nonprofits to incubate new entities. Right? If you want to start a new nonprofit for a great project, you don't have to wait 6-12 months to get the IRS recognition and blah blah. Right? You can just go to an existing nonprofit and they'll let you start out as a little part of theirs, and then in a year or two, you'll crash and burn and it'll go away, or you'll have success and you'll be able to spin out and become an independent nonprofit without a problem.
And then the second question, and I suspect that your book has a lot to say about this, is that can anything be done about Arabella and similar organizations on the left?
Well, we have to be sober and realize, billions of dollars just don't go away. So
Right.
it's not an easy thing to just, it's not like tomorrow we're going to knock it down. But there are multiple things. One is, you right now are educating a lot of people about this, and that's massively powerful because Arabella is really the Wizard of Oz, right? You go in and big, scary, frightening, powerful thing, right? And it affects you. But then when Toto pulls the curtain back and you see it's just some guy at a microphone, well, that's not so powerful anymore. Well, similarly, the fake groups are not as powerful once people realize, oh, that's just some new Arabella claptrap. So that's not a small thing. There are a few other things that could be done. I'm absolutely opposed to forced donor disclosure because the left will crush our people who give to anything.
Yeah,
We
I
know
agree.
that.
Yeah.
They have a lot more mobs than we do. So that's not a good idea. But you could have things like my personal favorite of all is 501c3 charities can't do voter registration and get out the vote. Now, they currently can only do it if it's nonpartisan.
Oh,
But
sure.
but
Yeah.
but Ed, I hate to tell you, you might not believe them at times when they like Zuckerbucks. That was all nonpartisan, purely nonpartisan.
Oh, yeah.
So
Of
so
course.
yeah, and by the way, Arabella put 25 million into that. Now Zuckerberg put 420 million, but Arabella put in 25. We didn't find out about that till a year after the election. The arguments I had with reporters about whether Zuckbucks was a partisan operation, that would have been helped a lot if I could have said, hey, you guys know what Arabella is. They threw in 25 mil too. So,
Well, those guys know what Arabella is, but they're not talking about it much, are they?
well, on a couple of occasions, the New York Times has done it. Once in a while, Open Secrets will do it. And The Atlantic did a hilarious interview with the head of Arabella a couple of years ago. They really sandbagged her because I can't tell you, it's one of the happiest days of my life when I read the thing. They were literally taking things straight out of my last Wall Street Journal op-ed about Arabella and putting them as questions to the president. And she was humming. In fact, it was so bad that after about 8 times of saying, aren't you just dark money like you lefties are always complaining about? And then finally the question came, aren't you just the same thing as the Kochs, the Koch brothers? And yeah. I will give you the entirety of this poor beaten down woman's reply. Yeah. Yeah. One word.
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly. All right.
And by the way, the Kochs are not nearly as big as this either, and they don't really use they don't use that pyramid structure particularly.
No, they're pretty open about their money and their influence. And at times the right has loved that, and at times not so much because they're more libertarian than anything else. And
yeah, well, that's the other thing. They are not, the Koch folks are not, I mean, love it or hate it, they're not joined at the hip with the Republican Party and haven't been for years now. Whereas Arabella, might as well be the DNC.
Well, except that they're better at fundraising than the DNC, clearly.
Yes.
All right. That's really all we've got today. But if you want more than this, you've got to go out and get the book, Arabella, the Dark Money Network of Leftist Billionaires Secretly Transforming America. That's available now on Amazon and
everywhere else.
And maybe Jeff Bezos is part of Arabella. I don't know. I don't want to ask. Maybe go look over at Barnes & Noble. I don't know what to tell you on that one, folks. Got to get it where you can find it. Arabella, the Dark Money Network of Leftist Billionaires Secretly Transforming America. Scott Walter, thank you so much for being with us today.
Great to be with you, Ed.